In the early days of the American space program, the astronauts captured the headlines. The public knew their names. They saw the launches, the parades, the television interviews, and the grainy black and white images of rockets rising into the sky. But behind those moments, behind every launch, every crew, every historic mission, there was a man whose decisions shaped the entire astronaut corps. A man who decided who would fly, who would command, who would land on the moon, and sometimes, who would never fly at all. His name was Deke Slayton. He was one of the original astronauts, a member of the legendary Mercury 7 selected in 1959. Like the others, he expected to strap himself into a spacecraft and help open the frontier of space. Instead, a medical diagnosis grounded him before he ever reached orbit. For most people, that might have been the end of the story. But for Deke Slayton, it was only the beginning, because while the other astronauts were flying missions, Slayton was quietly building something even more powerful: control over the astronaut office itself. As director of flight crew operations at NASA, Slayton became the man responsible for assigning astronauts to missions. That meant he helped choose the crews for Project Gemini, for Apollo program, for the missions that would eventually land humans on the moon. Astronauts trained for years hoping to hear one thing from Deke Slayton: "You've got a flight," and if they didn't hear it, their careers could stall forever. For more than a decade, Slayton watched the launches from the ground. He assigned missions, shaped careers, and built the astronaut corps into one of the most elite groups of pilots in history. But he never stopped wanting the one thing he had been denied: a chance to fly. And then, after 16 years of waiting, the opportunity finally came. In 1975, Slayton would climb aboard a spacecraft for the Apollo Soyuz Test Project, the first international mission of the space age. The astronaut who chose the astronauts was finally going to space. And to understand how that moment happened, we have to go back to the beginning, to a farm in Wisconsin, to a test pilot who never expected to become one of the most powerful figures in the history of human spaceflight.
Welcome to Orbital Briefing, the podcast where we explore the missions, the people, and the science that built humanity's journey into space. From Mercury to Artemis, we dive deep into the stories behind the rockets that carried us beyond Earth. This is Orbital Briefing.
Mission Control. Mission Control Message. Orbital Briefing is supported by the book The American Spaceplane, a story of ambition, risk, and reinvention. The space shuttle was designed to make spaceflight routine. Instead, it reshaped America's relationship with space. This book explores the full story of the shuttle program, from the political decisions that shaped its design, to the engineers and astronauts who brought the vehicle to life, and the triumphs and tragedies that defined an era of exploration. The American Spaceplane is available now on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and ebook. Mission Control out.
To understand the story of Deke Slayton, we have to go back to a moment when the United States was suddenly behind in the race for space. In October of 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 into orbit. The small beeping satellite shocked the world and ignited what would become known as the space race. The United States had rockets, scientists, and military test pilots, but it did not yet have a coordinated civilian space program. That changed in 1958 when the US government created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA. NASA's first goal was simple in concept, but incredibly difficult in practice: send an American into space. The program created to accomplish that mission was Project Mercury. Mercury's spacecraft would be tiny, little more than a metal capsule perched on top of a rocket. There would be almost no room to move. Astronauts would lie on their backs during launch, endure intense G-forces, and rely on a combination of automated systems and limited manual control to survive the trip into orbit. NASA needed pilots who could handle extreme pressure, make split-second decisions, and operate experimental vehicles that had never flown before. So the agency began searching for the best test pilots in the United States military. The requirements were strict. Candidates had to be experienced jet pilots, graduates of test pilot school, under 40 years old, shorter than 5 feet 11 inches to fit inside the capsule, and in exceptional physical condition. Out of hundreds of candidates, NASA selected just 7. They would become known as the Mercury Seven. The group included names that would become legendary in American history: Alan Shepard, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, Gordon Cooper, and Deke Slayton. When the astronauts were introduced to the public in April of 1959, they instantly became national heroes. They appeared on magazine covers, they signed exclusive contracts with the press. Their families became part of the national story. To the public, they were explorers preparing to open a new frontier. But inside NASA, things were far less certain. No one had ever launched a human being into orbit before. No one knew how the human body would react to weightlessness, and no one could guarantee that the rockets would work. Each Mercury astronaut hoped to be the first American in space. Each of them expected to fly. But the reality of spaceflight, and the unpredictable challenges of the human body, would change the course of one astronaut's career in a way no one could have predicted. For Deke Slayton, the dream of spaceflight was about to take a very unexpected turn. When the astronauts of Mercury 7 were introduced in 1959, each of them expected the same thing. They were going to fly. The spacecraft they would pilot were part of Project Mercury, a bold and urgent effort by NASA to send an American into space during the height of the Cold War. The Mercury capsule itself was remarkably small. Barely large enough for a single astronaut, the spacecraft was more like a seat surrounded by instrumentation than a traditional cockpit. The astronaut would lie almost flat on their back, surrounded by switches, gauges, and control handles. At launch, the capsule would sit atop a powerful rocket. First the Redstone for suborbital missions, and later the Atlas rocket for orbital flights. The astronaut inside would experience intense acceleration as the rocket climbed through the atmosphere, eventually reaching speeds of more than 17,000 miles per hour to achieve orbit around the Earth. For pilots like Deke Slayton, this kind of environment was familiar territory. Slayton had been a combat pilot during the Second World War and later became an experimental test pilot in the U.S. Air Force. Test pilots were used to flying aircraft that were still being developed, pushing machines to their limits, and managing situations where equipment might fail without warning. That mindset made them ideal candidates for spaceflight. Early on, NASA planned a series of increasingly ambitious Mercury missions. The first American flights would be short, suborbital hops, lasting only about 15 minutes. Later missions would attempt full orbital flights lasting several hours. Slayton was originally assigned to pilot one of the early orbital missions, a flight known as Mercury Atlas 7. If everything had gone according to plan, Deke Slayton might have become one of the first Americans to orbit the Earth. But during routine medical examinations in 1961, NASA doctors noticed something unusual in Slayton's heart rhythm. The condition, known as atrial fibrillation, caused an irregular heartbeat that could potentially become dangerous under the extreme stresses of launch and spaceflight. At first, the condition appeared mild. Slayton himself felt fine and continued training with the other astronauts. But as NASA doctors monitored the condition more closely, they became increasingly concerned. Human spaceflight was still completely experimental. No one fully understood how the body would react to weightlessness, high acceleration, or the stress of re-entry. NASA could not afford to take unnecessary risks. In 1962, just months before his scheduled flight, the agency made a difficult decision. Deke Slayton was grounded. He would not fly on Mercury. For one of the original astronauts, a man selected specifically to become a space pioneer, the decision was devastating. But what happened next would shape the entire future of the American Astronaut Corps, because instead of leaving the program, Slayton was given a new responsibility inside NASA, a role that would make him one of the most influential figures in the history of human spaceflight. The early years of American human spaceflight were defined by a small group of pilots who would become some of the most recognizable figures in the country. The Mercury 7 were more than just test pilots. They were symbols of national ambition during the Cold War, representing the United States in a technological competition with the Soviet Union. Among them were astronauts like Alan Shepard, who would ride a Redstone rocket into space in 1961, and John Glenn, whose orbital flight in 1962 made him an international hero. Others in the group included Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, and Gordon Cooper. Together, these 7 men formed the foundation of the American Astronaut Corps. But while most of the Mercury astronauts were flying missions, Deke Slayton suddenly found himself in a very different role. After being grounded due to his heart condition, NASA assigned Slayton to work within the astronaut office. In 1962, he became the coordinator responsible for astronaut activities. A few years later, he was formally named Director of Flight Crew Operations at NASA. That title might sound administrative, but in practice, it gave Slayton enormous influence. He was responsible for selecting astronauts for missions. He determined which crews would train together, and he played a major role in deciding who would command the flights that defined the next era of space exploration. As NASA moved from Project Mercury to Project Gemini and eventually to the Apollo program, the astronaut corps grew rapidly. New astronauts were selected from the same elite pool of military test pilots, including future legends like Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Pete Conrad, Jim Lovell, and many others. These astronauts would eventually fly some of the most daring missions in the history of exploration. But before any of them launched into space, there was one person whose approval they needed: Deke Slayton. Inside NASA, astronauts knew that assignments often came down to a simple conversation with Slayton. If he believed in a crew, they might find themselves training for a historic mission. If he didn't, their chances of flying could disappear entirely. In a quiet office far from the launch pads of Florida, Deke Slayton became the architect of the American Astronaut Corps. He helped shape the crews that would carry out the missions of Gemini, the missions that would land humans on the moon during Apollo, and the missions that would define the golden age of human spaceflight. All while he continued waiting patiently for a chance to fly himself. The career of Deke Slayton unfolded over more than 2 decades, spanning nearly the entire early history of American human spaceflight. In 1959, Slayton was selected as one of the Mercury Seven, the elite group of military test pilots chosen to fly in Project Mercury. At the time, he was widely considered one of the strongest pilots in the group, calm under pressure, technically skilled, and deeply respected by the other astronauts. By 1961, NASA had begun assigning astronauts to specific Mercury missions. Slayton was originally scheduled to fly an orbital mission known as Mercury Atlas 7, but during medical testing that year, doctors detected an irregular heartbeat. After months of monitoring and debate, NASA made the difficult decision in 1962 to remove Slayton from flight status due to atrial fibrillation. Instead of leaving the astronaut corps, Slayton accepted a new role within NASA. He became responsible for astronaut assignments. Over the next decade, Slayton helped shape the flight crews for the programs that followed Mercury. During Project Gemini, he assigned astronauts to the missions that tested rendezvous techniques, long-duration flights, and spacewalks, all critical steps toward reaching the moon. Then came the Apollo program. As Director of Flight Crew Operations, Slayton played a central role in selecting the crews that would carry out the Apollo missions, including the historic flight of Apollo 11. Astronaut assignments followed a rough rotation system. Backup crews for one mission would often become prime crews 3 missions later. Slayton managed that rotation, balancing experience, personality, technical skills, and sometimes the difficult realities of politics and risk. For more than a decade, he watched the launches from the ground: Gemini missions, Apollo missions, moon landings. All the while, Slayton continued working quietly to resolve the heart condition that had grounded him. By the early 1970s, doctors began to believe that his atrial fibrillation had stabilized. In 1972, after years of treatment and monitoring, NASA finally restored Slayton's flight status. The astronaut who had once been grounded was now cleared to fly again. 3 years later, he would finally climb into a spacecraft. In July of 1975, Slayton launched aboard the Apollo Soyuz Test Project, a historic mission that marked the first international cooperation in human spaceflight between the United States and the Soviet Union, 16 years after being selected as an astronaut and 13 years after being grounded. Deke Slayton finally went to space. The story of Deke Slayton is not just the story of an astronaut who waited 16 years to reach space. It is the story of the man who quietly shaped the entire American astronaut corps during the most important years of human spaceflight. From the outside, the history of early space exploration often looks like a series of heroic individual moments. A rocket launches, an astronaut floats in weightlessness, a crew lands on the moon, But behind every one of those moments was a complex system of training, planning, engineering, and personnel decisions that determined who would be sitting inside the spacecraft when the countdown reached zero. For more than a decade, Deke Slayton was the person responsible for those decisions. As director of flight crew operations at NASA, Slayton managed astronaut assignments during the transition from Project Mercury to Project Gemini, and ultimately to the Apollo program. That meant he helped determine which astronauts would fly the missions that developed the techniques of space rendezvous, long-duration flight, and spacewalks. And ultimately, he helped select the crews who would attempt the most ambitious mission ever undertaken by humanity, the journey to the moon. When Apollo 11 launched in July of 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended to the lunar surface. Their names became part of history. But the crew that flew that mission, and the backup crews, and the crews that followed, were part of a larger system that Slayton had helped design. His assignment strategy created a pipeline of crews that trained together over multiple missions, building experience and trust long before they ever reached the launch pad. It was a system that allowed NASA to move quickly during the intense years of the space race, launching missions at a pace that would be almost unimaginable today. Slayton was known among astronauts as fair, direct, and intensely loyal to the people who worked for him. He understood the personalities of the pilots in the astronaut office. He knew who worked well together. He knew who could command a mission under pressure. And he knew that sometimes the hardest decision was telling an astronaut that they would not be flying. In many ways, Slayton became the quiet architect of the astronaut corps. The astronauts who flew the missions became famous, but the man assigning those missions was shaping the future of human spaceflight from behind the scenes. And perhaps that is what makes Slayton's story so remarkable. Even after losing his own chance to fly, he stayed. He built the teams. He helped guide the missions. He watched as others walked on the moon. And through it all, he never stopped believing that one day he might still get his own chance to leave Earth.
Mission Control Update. Orbital Briefing is supported by the American Spaceplane, a story of ambition, risk, and reinvention, a book exploring the rise, triumphs, and legacy of the Space Shuttle program. From the engineers who designed it, to the astronauts who flew it, the story of the shuttle is a story of ambition, risk, and the pursuit of routine access to space. Available now on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and ebook. Mission Control, returning you to the mission.
The career of Deke Slayton reminds us that the history of space exploration is not only written by the people who sit inside the spacecraft, it is also shaped by the people who build the teams. In the early years of NASA, spaceflight was still experimental, risky, and deeply uncertain. Rockets exploded on launch pads, systems failed in flight. Astronauts trained for years without knowing whether they would ever receive an assignment. In that environment, leadership mattered. Slayton brought a pilot's mindset to the astronaut office, calm, direct, and focused on results. He believed in giving astronauts time to develop experience, pairing crews who worked well together, and building a system where each mission prepared astronauts for the next. The rotation system he helped establish during Project Gemini carried forward into the Apollo program, creating a pipeline of trained crews ready for increasingly complex missions. That system is one of the reasons NASA was able to achieve one of the most extraordinary milestones in human history, landing astronauts on the moon before the end of the 1960s. But Slayton's legacy is also deeply personal. Astronauts respected him because he had once been in their position. He had gone through the same selection process, trained in the same simulators, and expected to take the same risks. When NASA grounded him due to his heart condition, he could have walked away from the program entirely. Instead, he stayed. He helped build the astronaut corps. He shaped the crews that would carry out the missions of the space race, and after 16 years of waiting, he finally climbed aboard a spacecraft and became part of that history himself during the Apollo Soyuz Test Project. In many ways, Deke Slayton's career represents a different kind of heroism in the story of spaceflight, not the heroism of a single launch or a single mission, but the steady leadership that makes those missions possible. Because sometimes the person who shapes history is the one deciding who gets the chance to make it. In July of 1975, when the spacecraft of the Apollo Soyuz Test Project lifted off from Cape Canaveral, one of the astronauts on board had already spent more than 16 years waiting for that moment. For Deke Slayton, the launch represented something deeply personal. He had been there at the beginning of the American space program, selected in 1959 as one of the Mercury Seven when human spaceflight was still little more than an idea. He had watched as other astronauts made history. He had helped assign the crews that flew the missions of Project Gemini. He had helped shape the teams that carried out the Apollo program and placed human beings on the moon. And after years of leadership behind the scenes, he finally took his own place aboard a spacecraft. Deke Slayton's journey reminds us that the story of space exploration is not always about the first person to reach orbit or the first person to walk on another world. Sometimes it is about persistence, about staying committed to a mission even when the path changes, about helping others achieve greatness while still believing that your own moment might come. And for Slayton, that moment finally arrived. Not at the beginning of the space race, but at the moment when two rival nations chose cooperation over competition in orbit. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Orbital Briefing. I'm Ron Walker, and this has been a production of Retrojet Studios. If you enjoyed today's deep dive into the life of Deke Slayton, make sure to follow the podcast and leave a review. It really helps others discover the show. You can also follow all things space and exploration at retrojetstudios.com. And be sure to join me next time when we fast forward from the early days of human spaceflight to the future, as NASA prepares to send astronauts back to the moon for the first time in more than 50 years with the Artemis program. Until next time, keep looking up.
Thanks for listening to Orbital Briefing. This show is hosted by Ron Walker and is a production of Retrojet Studios. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to follow the show, leave a review, and share it with a fellow space enthusiast. To follow all things space, visit retrojetstudios.com. Until next time, keep looking up.